This is a very important topic. My job as an instructor, as a teacher, is to tell you all what happened in the most interesting way possible. That's my job here. So while this may sound like a story, do not mistake this for the lesson that it is. And as you listen, as we go through time, put this into the context of your life mission. Use this as an opportunity to correct the miseducation and misinformation that you've been indoctrinated with matriculating through the public school system. All right. A lot of this information you've heard, some of it you have not heard. But as we fill in more pieces and as this course progresses, you all will develop a more complete 360 of who you are, how you came to be, the world around you, and your place in that world. In other words, Black consciousness or knowledge of self. So for you to truly understand who you are, family, you got to go back to the beginning. For us to look at so-called Black history in the context of slavery, for us to look at Black history in the context of the Ma'afa, for us to look at Black history in the context of Kemet is not enough. We've got to go back at least 300,000 years. Of the creatures that walked the earth before 300,000 years, many of them resembled us, but these were not humans. They did not possess the anatomy, nor did they possess the consciousness that we possessed back then and still possess today. Back then, 300,000 years ago, every part of the world was lush and fertile, every part except for Europe. These landscapes were frozen wastelands. They were nightmarish, windswept terrains where the sun vanished for half the year and barely rose above the horizon for the other. The areas north of 40 degrees latitude were places that were so unfit for human habitation that survival was only possible. How? By retreating into subterranean caves. These were not the gardens of Eden talked about in the Bible. And speaking of in the Bible of the Hebrews, it said that the Garden of Eden is the cradle of mankind. Genesis 2:13 claims that one of the rivers flowing out of Eden winds through the entire land of Cush. If you have your Bibles, go to Genesis 2:13, and it says it right there. But as anthropologist Jean-Jacques Houblon put it, if there was a Garden of Eden, it was the size of the continent of Africa. So here are some of the lies that you've been told, just to set our conversation into context. Some of the lies that you've been told. Lie number one, we don't know who the original people were. Lie number two, the Garden of Eden was in the Middle East somewhere. Lie number three, humanity popped up in multiple places outside of Africa. Have you all heard those lies?
Yep. Heard all of them.
Nope.
Well, we're going to dispel two of those in a moment. One of them needs to be dispelled right now. I keep making reference to the Garden of Eden because when we go back to the beginning, typically we think, well, the beginning started in the Garden of Eden, right? Here's where the concept of the Garden of Eden being placed in the Middle East came from. The ruler of Rome, you all know where I'm going with this, but follow me. The ruler of Rome at the time when this was decided was who? Constantine. So the Roman Empire was facing a number of issues. The empire had gotten too big for itself. And some genius decided, you know what, in order to better manage what's going on with our empire, we should split it into two. Instead of having one emperor, we should have two emperors. Now, this made sense for a number of reasons. Number one, it would make the economy more manageable. And number two, in the western part of Rome, they were dealing with barbarian hordes that were relentless. These were their savage cousins. They're less civilized components, right? And there are levels to this thing. So we can say, well, Rome itself wasn't civilized, and you'd be absolutely right. But these were the bastard barbarian, ascendants of the Roman Empire. Those were the Franks, the Visigoths, those who would later become the Vikings, and that group of people. Those were the ones in the western part of the empire. Okay, so we're thinking Germany, France, present day Germany, France, those areas, Belgium, etc. True indeed. The eastern part of the empire was the more civilized part of the empire. It was the part of the Roman Empire that was closer to the spiritual centers of the planet, namely Kemet. Now look, by the time Rome split, Kemet had already descended. However, the knowledge that was kept in Kemet had disseminated out into the rest of the world. So now you had the knowledge, the light that came out of Kemet showing up in the Middle East, showing up in Asia, in the Dravidian culture, showing up in the Far Eastern cultures, right? So this was the part of the Roman Empire that was closer to the cradle of mankind and the cradle of knowledge. So this was the more civilized part of Rome. That put the Middle East in Rome's backyard. And we're talking about Eastern Rome, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire. And so when Constantine crafted his entire Christian ideology, it but made sense for him to put the Garden of Eden in his own backyard, as well as everything else associated with Christianity. It became the Constantine brand of Christianity. It became a bastardized, stepped on, passed down, and passed over version of Christianity. And that's how the Garden of Eden came to be in Rome's backyard, rather than where it truly is, the continent of Africa. 300,000 years ago, come back in time with me. Before then, there were no conscious humans. Then, around 300,000 years ago, the great leap forward happened. All of a sudden, there was an awakening of human consciousness. There was an awakening of language. There was an awakening of culture. Something happened that separated human beings from every other animal on the planet. What that something is subject to speculation. It is important that we differentiate anatomical human beings from conscious human beings. It's important for us to differentiate anatomical human beings from conscious human beings. Here's what I mean by anatomical human beings. They look like us. They have the same body parts. They have the same mechanisms. I'm talking about Australopithecus. I'm talking about Neanderthals. I'm talking about Homo erectus. These may be anatomical human beings, but they are not conscious human beings. Just as chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas have a similar appearance, those animals cannot be classified as humans, correct? You wouldn't call a gorilla a human, although a gorilla has a similar anatomy to us. However, science has called all these subhuman groups members of the human family. A more appropriate term would be hominid, which means human-like. This is important because one of the lies that you've been told, one of the ways that they have manipulated you intellectually and scientifically is by telling you that you are a Homo erectus, that you are a subhuman species, that the first group of people to come out of the African continent were subhuman, meaning you are a subhuman. They're scientifically calling you a gorilla. But as we're going to see as we progress, they are the subhumans. There are three factors that define a conscious human being. Number one, symbiotic culture. Symbiotic culture, SYMBOLIC, symbiotic culture. That's just a real sexy way of saying the ability to teach the next generation what you've learned. All right, to pass on your culture to the next generation. So what are we talking about when we're talking about culture? We're talking about music. We're talking about patterns of behavior. We're talking about collective knowledge. We're talking about how we interact with each other in our relationships, right? Social norms, ways, and mores. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about culture. That's number one. That's the first thing that defines a human being, a conscious human being. When we look at Neanderthals, Neanderthals had no culture. Australopithecus had no culture. Homo erectus had no culture. Homo habilis had no culture. Cro-Magnon had no culture. Now, when you look at us and I'm talking about the African, I'm talking about the conscious human being, we see evidence of culture. So let me give you an example. 200,000 years ago, there's evidence of a cosmetic industry in a place called Blombos. So that's the very first makeup industry. That's a sign of culture. And that happened 200,000 years ago. So 200,000 years ago, the ladies was already doing makeup, right? 200,000 years ago, we see our ancestors being able to pass on what they learned and transmitting their behavioral traditions from one generation to the next. Okay, so one generation knew how to weave quilts, the next generation knew how to weave quilts. We do not see that with Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and these other groups, Neanderthals or Cro-Magnon. All right, so I said that there were how many factors that define a conscious human being? How many are there?
3.
There are 3. The first is symbolic culture. The second one is language. All right, language. All right, so when I'm saying language, I'm not talking about the ability to communicate using vocal intonations. That's what your dogs do. Dogs communicate using vocal intonations, right? Almost all animals communicate using vocal intonation. Vocal intonations, unless they are using pheromones. Okay, so that's how animals communicate primarily: light, pheromones, or sound. That's not what we're talking about. Language starts with phonemes. A phoneme is an intonation that cannot be broken down into a lesser element. All right, so these are the atoms of languages. They can't be broken down any further. So let me give you an example. K. All right, K is a phoneme. There is no way that I can break down K or G. Those are phonemes. All right, so those are phonemes. Those are basically grunts. And the human brain doesn't learn languages through written words. The human brain learns languages by hearing them. So a child comes into the world with 150 sounds. A child comes into this world able to make 150 sounds. But listen to all the sounds that your child makes, all these reverberations that your child is able to make. All right. Out of the 6,500 human languages that exist, there are about 150 sounds. Right now, no language uses all of those sounds. But the most advanced languages on the planet use the vast majority of those sounds at its disposal. So the hardest languages to learn are your tonal languages that use more than 100 phonemes. All right. That's why these languages are so hard to learn. Languages like the Xhosa language that uses clicks and tones. And by tones, I mean by changing the tone of a word, you change its entire meaning.
That's that's like us, yo.
Right? The English language has 44 phonemes, just 44 phonemes, whereas your indigenous languages have 140. All right? What do you do with phonemes? Phonemes come together to create what are called morphemes. A morpheme is a word or a sound that can't be broken down further without losing its meaning. Okay? In other words, cat. Can't break that down any further. You know that cat, a morpheme consisting of several phonemes, means an animal of, that particular species, right? And you put all that together, and then sounds become words, words become full sentences, and that's how the brain learns where one word ends and another one begins by putting those words into a pattern that give the sentence meaning. That is what makes a human being. The ability to grunt doesn't make a human being. The ability to bark doesn't make a human being. And it also doesn't mean that there is language that would be recognizable by an intelligent human being. All we are hearing are phonemes. The ability to turn those phonemes into morphemes and put all that together and form sentences is what makes a human being. So the human brain develops in stages. In stage 1 and 2, your brain learns to recognize sounds. And over time, as you adapt to the world around you, you drop some of those 150 phonemes that you come into the world with. Why is this important? The language that you use creates a frequency that your body responds to. The language that you use creates a frequency that your body responds to. Every planet vibrates according to a frequency, including Earth, whose frequency is 432 megahertz. The same frequency produced from the word Om.
That's why.
The first women and men used tonal languages. These were languages that changed the pitch of a morpheme, that changed the meaning of the word, and also changes the way the body responds to vibrations being produced by the percussion within you. Those pitches, those tones create a vibration within your body. That vibration becomes a percussion upon which your organs are played. I don't think it's sheer irony that we call our organs which are instruments meant to be played, because the percussion of the words that we use and the tones that we use produce a vibration within our body that has a direct effect on our consciousness. The chords of your voice box, and of course there's that instrument reference again. Chords within your voice box create vibrations on the drums of your ears and the organs of your body, all of which are played like instruments. The beat of your heart, and we can go on and on. I say all that to say this: tonal languages inspire the growth of brain cells. They inspire healing. They inspire deep states of consciousness. They inspire a resonance with the planet. And the further we go back in history and the closer we get to the source, the more resonance we see with the planet, represented by the 141 phonemes that are still in existence in African languages. And I say all that to say this as well: the further we move away from tonal languages, the less intelligent we become, the more impotent our language becomes, the more out of sync with natural vibrations we become.
True.
Again, I said that there were 144, typically 144 phonemes on the African continent, 141, 144. In the English language, only 44. We're using a regressive language. And that is in part responsible for our sickness, our de-evolution. This is absolute fact, family. And when I say sickness, I mean that literally. Sound can heal and sound can harm. In the military, they're developing sonic weapons as we speak. And they've been developing them since the war in Panama during the 80s, when they first started experimenting with sonic weapons for crowd control. Sound can also be used to heal. All right. Sound is currently being used to destroy cancer cells. But we don't need something external to heal ourselves. All we need to do is get back to our natural percussive ability.
That makes so much sense why they stole our language in the first place.
True indeed. True indeed. That's also why we encourage all of you to learn one of your indigenous tonal languages. So there are three things that make a human being. What is the first thing? A conscious human being.
Symbolic.
Yeah.
Symbolic culture. Absolutely. Your ability to pass down your culture from generation to generation. What's number two?
Language.
Language. Language. Exactly. Language. Language beyond phonemes. So phonemes are typically grunts. Any creature can produce a phoneme. And then the final component of a conscious human being is intelligence. Now, let me break down the definition of intelligence. The definition of intelligence is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills. All right. That's only one, but not the exclusive aspect of being a human being. So we see Australopithecus, we see Homo habilis, we see Homo heidelbergus, we see Neanderthals, we see Cro-Magnon creating tools. All right. We see them with some sort of intelligence, some sort of ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills. But what they're missing are the other components of what makes a human being conscious. All right. So now we can start to redefine what a human being truly is. Your legacy as the original and most intelligent people on the planet, most in harmony with the frequencies of nature, right? That's your legacy. When a conscious human being rises up, they possess intelligence, they possess language, they possess culture, they start to ask important questions. Who am I? How did I get here? What does the world around me look like? And what is my place in that world? Now, to answer that third question, what does the world around me look like? We began the first real age of exploration 300,000 years ago. By 300,000 years ago, we had already spread out all over the African continent. So we're going to get into the origins, or what we believe are the hypothetical origins of humankind, in just a minute. First of all, let me talk about this age of exploration, because for some reason in conscious circles, this still isn't discussed. And I kind of understand why. There are all kinds of groups out there that have all kinds of theories about Lemuria and, you know, us being the indigenous people of North America, which of course is true. But these groups tend to warp science for their ideology. Family. What am I talking about? If I'm suggesting that we are God's chosen people, then I got to put our origins, and I'm using the Constantine Bible, then I got to put our origins where?
In the Middle East.
I got to put our origins in the Middle East. Because if I put our origins where science indicates that we came from, then that would negate my whole platform.
If you're using the Constantine Bible.
If you're using the Constantine Bible.
Yeah.
Right? I see what you get. I'm not going to chase you down that rabbit hole. I already know what you on, fam. But let me use a different group. Okay, so the indigenous movement. There's the rise of the indigenous movement. And while they're suggesting that we were the first people in the Americas, which is absolutely true, as you see on this map, they've taken some things out of context so that it would fit their platform. Look, family, I'm not interested in building any kind of platform on pseudoscience. I bring you the facts. Some of it is the result of low racial self-esteem. Some groups out there, no matter how black they profess to be, refuse to acknowledge that they're African.
Sure.
Call me anything but African. Now, where did we first hear that? Like, who's the lowest on the social and human and anthropological totem pole? Well, the African. So if you believe that, you're going to carry those beliefs over into your actions. And you're going to build platforms. You're going to build ideologies that negate and refute your African origins out of low racial self-esteem. Look, every other group on the planet acknowledges this. Why not us? So about 185,000 years ago, we had the crossing of the Red Sea. We had the first proverbial crossing of the Red Sea. According to the science that we have, about 5,000 of us started the journey out of Africa. And around 185,000 years ago, we ended up in Israel, where we started building. Okay? About 100,000 years ago, we also left the central part of Africa, somewhere around the Sahara Desert, and we moved into South Africa. So by 100,000 years ago, South Africa was occupied. Okay? Having circumnavigated, on land at least, the African continent, around 72,000 years ago, Aborigines left. We already knew how to navigate the seas 72,000 years ago. And by 72,000 years ago, we have the arrival of our first people on the Australian continent. Okay? Around 60,000 years ago, we had conquered the Indian continent. Now, here's where things started to change. And we're going to get into this when we talk about Zeptepi and when we get into the grand procession, the equinocti. All right. But 60,000 years ago, we had already conquered the Middle East and the Indian continent. We had already started establishing what would come to be known as the Dravidian culture. And 40,000 years ago, only 40,000 years ago. Now, some people ask the question, how is it that we left the African continent 72,000 years ago, but we only reached Europe 40,000 years ago? Anyone have any hypotheses? Why is it that we were able to go all the way across the globe 72,000 years ago, but we were only able to get into Europe about 40,000 years ago?
It was still in ice.
It was in an ice age. It was in an ice age. This period of time was called the Worm Glaciation, WURM. And it began about 70,000 years ago. In other words, it was hostile to human life. There was a thawing. There was a temporary thawing around 40,000 years ago. And when that thawing happened, our original people the first human beings, and you all remember, if you read Civilization or Barbarism, Sheikh Anta Diop goes in on this, but our original people moved into the European continent. This was a temporary thawing of that ice age because the worm glaciation lasted 70,000 years, which means what? Our people were trapped, right? 40,000 years ago, the very first black men, women, and children who started exploring Europe found themselves trapped in the worm glaciation. We're going to come back to that. 35,000 years ago, we were all over Asia. That includes Japan. We're going to get back to that as well. By 25,000 years ago, we had reached North America's west coast. And I say west coast because the anthropological evidence for us arriving at the east coast is still being developed, still being worked on. But there is absolutely nothing to suggest intellectually that we wouldn't be able to make it to the east coast of the east coast of the Americas if we were able to make it all the way to Australia 72,000 years ago. All right, so we're going to come back to that. And by 15,000 years ago, which coincides with the end of the Ice Age, we see the very first recognizable European cultures. So it took 25,000 years for the first European culture to pop up from the time that we arrived to the end of that glaciation. Okay, so we're going to come back to that, but your legacy was stolen from you when any group tells you that you were not the first founder of the civilizations of humanity. That's what I want to emphasize to you all right now. You and your ancestors were the first everywhere. And next week, I'm going to give you irrefutable evidence of the fact that your mothers and your fathers were the founders of Indian, Asian, and American civilization. We're going to come back to all these areas next week and examine them, but I just wanted to put that into context for you all. So we're going to start off with Zeptepi. Now, first of all, who's never heard the term Zeptepi?
I haven't.
I guess a better question is who has?
I've heard that term once.
Zeptepi is the first rising of the sun. That's what it translates. It is a Kemetic phrase, Kemet being the proper name for what the Albion calls Egypt. Zeptepi, the time of the first rising of the sun, began when Atum, or Atum, A-T-U-M, created the duality that would set the stage for civilization, and it would climax with the Asarian drama. So this is the very first origin story, the story that would ultimately give birth to the Genesis creation story. Now we see similarities here, and I wanted to draw a quick parallel between this creation story and the story that we see in Genesis, because in Genesis, what is the climax? The climax of the creation, the process of creation, was the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve. Our proverbial Adam and Eve were who?
Haru and
Heru is the Jesus symbolism that's transmutated in Christianity. So we have Osiris and Isis, whose appropriate names are Asar and Aset.
Yep.
So the period of time known as Zeptepi lasted for about 100,000 years. This is a period that civilization refined itself through what were called the Grand Processions. The Grand Procession is a period of time that lasts 25,772 years. That's the amount of time the Earth takes to complete its axial wobble. Its axial wobble. Not only does the Earth revolve around the sun, but the Earth revolves around its own axis. We call this an axial wobble. And it takes 25,772 years for the Earth to complete an axial wobble. And every 25,772 years, there is a period of upheaval and change, as we are going to see. So there are 4 of these periods in what is known as Zeptepi, Kemetic prehistory. 4 of these periods. And throughout these periods, humankind was refined. Halfway through what's called the Great Year, and I need you all to write that down, the Great Year, that is also known as the Grand Procession. In Kemetic science, 1 year lasted 25,772 years. So your ancestors considered 25,772 years as the great year, the grand procession. It is the amount of time that Earth takes to complete its axial wobble. That's going to be important coming up later on. And this is a period when they say divinity ruled the earth. These were men and women who so thoroughly represented the divine principles that they were called gods on earth. This was Zeptepi. It was a golden age of human civilization, an age that was free of conflict, an age that was replete with growth, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, and laid the foundation for human civilization. Halfway through the great year, in the year 11,700 BC, the Saharan apocalypse began. See, that's how specific we can get with this, and geologists have confirmed this as well. Remember earlier I said that during these great processions, every 25,772 years, there was a great upheaval. This was one of those great upheavals because as the earth tilted on its wobble, it changed the position of continents on the planet, which means we have the melting of the ice that had trapped our ancestors in the north. But when that ice started melting, what we had evolved into in order to survive that environment was unrecognizable from the people that initially arrived there. So what you see on your screen is a scientific rendition of what these Neanderthals, which is at the top left side of your screen, and a Cro-Magnon, which is at the bottom left side of your screen, looks like. So we know that there was interbreeding, and we know this because non-Black races today carry between 1 and 2.5% Neanderthal DNA from that interbreeding. So we know that happened. That created a group of human hybrids called, again, Cro-Magnon. We also know that low light environments create melanin recession. We also know that low light environments create melanin recession. What you see on the upper right-hand side of your screen are animals that live in caves, animals that have never been exposed to light. They have absolutely no pigment because they need no pigment. No sunlight, no melanin. Make sense? So we know that these two factors were at play, and that gave rise to what you see on your screen in the direct center, modern day Cro-Magnon. It is my suggestion that Cro-Magnon never went extinct. They will tell you that. Cro-Magnon lives today. These subhuman, quasi-human, human hybrids will tell you that you are the subhuman, when in reality, they are the evolutionary response to living in low-light environments and a direct result of interbreeding, which is why as much as 2.5% of their DNA is composed of Neanderthal DNA. Does that make sense, family? Because we came from environments of abundance, and because the Albion comes from an environment of scarcity, when they arrive, we gave freely and continued to give and continued to give and continued to give until ultimately we found ourselves in bondage, dealing with a group of people that did not share our value system, which was unfathomable for us because the vast majority of the planet all shared the same value system until you had the Albion coming out of his frozen wasteland and her frozen wasteland and decimating the entire planet. Unaelewa? All right. So for those of you who can't see the screen, around the last precession of the equinox, the last great year, the Earth's axis shifted, leading to the destruction of the Sahara and its civilizations. There are civilizations unexplored beneath the sands in the Sahara. This is verified. In fact, I'll give you all the coordinates probably in the notes later on, but you can go onto Google Maps, which is how they found some of these civilizations, and visit the Sahara Desert, which, by the way, is so hot, you cannot visit unless you had a spacesuit on. But if we rewind time around the end of the last glaciation, around the middle of the last great year, the Saharan Desert was a vast, lush Sahara, just like the Nile Valley. Many civilizations, we believe, we hypothesize, existed there, and that is the cradle of human civilization. Now we call that, and that's the cradle of mankind. Now we call it the cradle of mankind because when we look at dispersal patterns, we see that all the dispersal patterns of early humanity originated around that era, around that area that we call the Sahara Desert. Make sense? We don't know exactly what these civilizations were comprised of and, you know, their philosophy, but we do know that the vast majority of their members, these refugees, ended up in the Nile Valley because it was the closest source of water. And because of that, there were conflicts. All right. And that's going to get us into our final segment, our discussion, our very brief discussion on the Nile Valley civilizations. So I want to take a quick second. We're going to talk about Kemet, and specifically, we're going to talk about 3 periods. I'm going to talk about the beginning, the 18th, and the 25th dynasties. But before we do that, we talked about Zeptepi, and we talked about the refinement of human civilization, right? We talked about Asar and Aset, laying the foundations for Kemetic society. There's one individual who has done something that no one else was able to do since, all right? And this was Narmer, otherwise known as the son of the Scorpion King. The Scorpion King was a warrior in Kemet. All of these refugees coming out of the Saharan desert many of them ended up in the Nile Valley. Some of them ended up in what is present-day Nigeria to establish what was known as the Kingdom of Nok, which we're going to get into. Some of them ended up establishing the Phoenician empires. Some of them ended up in present-day Morocco, and some of them continued on south. We're specifically talking about the groups that ended up along the Nile Valley. When those groups ended up along the Nile Valley, there were already people there. We're talking about 3400 BC. So up until now, we've been talking about hundreds of thousands of years in the past, you know, tens of thousands of years in the past. Now we're getting relatively recent because now we're talking about what, 5,100 some odd years ago? How old is modern civilization? How long has the technology that we're using now been around? Cell phones, laptops, cars, planes, hyperloops. How long has this been around? Since about the industrial age, right? How long is that?
Not even a century.
Not even a century, right?
Mm-hmm.
Y'all following me?
Yeah.
I am laying out 300,000 years of human history. Is it unfathomable that we could destroy ourselves within the next 50 years as a result of the technology that we've produced and created? Absolutely. Nuclear war is a possibility. Creating a virus that destroys the vast majority of human population is a possibility. And when we look over the course of human history, we see many bottlenecks happening across many regions. Is it unfathomable that we have created advanced civilizations in the past whose technology was greater than ours that could have potentially been destroyed or destroyed themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Kemetic civilization lasted, 5,500 years?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they're still, they haven't even started breaching the science that went into the construction of the Great Pyramids. They haven't even finished finding the buildings. Every day they're breaking into a new level, a new substrata, a new set of tombs, a new set of structures that add on to what we know about this 5,000-year-long civilization. So all I'm saying to you all is open up your imaginations. It's not unlikely, because we've only been doing this for about a century, right? We've only been doing this for 100 years. We're talking about 300,000 years of human history. Even if that was spaced out over the course of 1,000 years, that gives us 3,000 advanced civilizations that have come and gone. So around 3,400 BC, so getting myself back on track, there were 2 separate kingdoms. There was the Red Land to the north, and by the north, we're basing this on the Nile River Delta, and that extends all along the Nile. And then there was what they call the White Land in the south. In the south, you had a king, and he was called the Scorpion King, and he made the first attempts to push out who they considered invaders from the north around 3200. Who were these invaders? These invaders were the Arabs, a group of people who would later become known as the Hyksos. Because remember, we've been talking about 75,000, 300,000 years of human adaptation and evolution. By then, different groups had popped up. We're going to talk more about those groups later on. All right. While the Scorpion King would not succeed because he was killed in the process on a hunting accident. According to legend, he was eaten by a hippo, or he was attacked by a hippo, which isn't unlikely because they're ugly, vicious beasts who are known to kill human beings. A century later, one of his offspring, and his name was Menes or Narmer, would finally subdue the north and unify the country, becoming the first sultan of the very first dynasty. And this happened 5,165 years ago in 3150 BC. This family was the very first war of unification. They call this the War of the Double Crown. Now, for those of you all who have gone through the third degree work study course, you know that there are 4 types of wars. Anybody remember what those are?
War of liberation, war of annihilation,
Unification.
War
of unification.
Yeah, war of unification.
Unification, liberation, annihilation, and subjugation, right? Unification, liberation, annihilation, and subjugation. This was the very first war of unification, and it was called the War of the Double Crown, fought in 3150 BC. And at the end of that war, once Menes had achieved the results that he had set out to achieve, Kemet remained unified, powerful, and stable for 1,000 years. That's 6 dynasties. Now, what happened? On your screen, you're going to see first intermediate period, second intermediate period, third intermediate period. Is there anybody who knows what is meant by the phrase intermediate period?
That's when they didn't have a sultan or pharaoh, right?
Not necessarily. These are periods of upheaval, civil wars. Think of these as dark ages.
Yeah, that's what I mean, kind of. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, true indeed. There was sloppy administration. They were decentralized. The central administration had fallen apart and it coming back together. And typically, these were periods of invasion. All right. Or they were periods of civil war. And the first intermediate period at the end of those 6 dynasties happened because people started getting too rich, started feeling themselves. A civil class warfare broke out, and it lasted for 405 years. 405 years of civil war. So again, when you all see intermediate periods, think dark ages. And while we were busy fighting amongst ourselves, we had wave after wave of invasions. The same people that had been pushed out by Menes, they weren't completely gone. They were developing their own warlike cultures, their own vindictiveness, and they would always come back. And ultimately, they would create a mixed group of people called the Egyptians. And I use that word intentionally, family. Okay? Go ahead.
I was agreeing.
True indeed. I use that word intentionally because it's important that we differentiate the mixed race Egyptians from the original founders of Kemet. This is how Kemet became Egypt. These waves of invaders, the Hyksos, the Sea People, ultimately the Islamic wave, the Roman wave, all contributed to the mixing of the races in Kemet and ultimately the whitewashing of the empire.
Yeah, Egypt came from the Greek word Egyptos.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So during these intermediate periods, what we have are invaders coming in. They are integrating into Kemet. They're setting up their own capitals. They're tearing down Kemetic cultures. And this would go on back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until around 1292 BC. That would kick off the Great 18th Dynasty. By 1292, we had gotten tired of all the invaders. We had gotten tired of all the civil wars, and we decided to restore Kemet to its glory. And they did. I just want you all to take a look at the faces on your screen. Queen T looks like my ex-girlfriend. I got a head shaped like Akhenaten. I'm just playing. What color is I really don't. What color is Nefertiti? What does she look like to you all?
She don't look right.
Hmm?
That Nefertiti, is that the one that came out of Eurasia?
But
No,
the
that
bust,
yeah, that's the original bust. No, not that you're. I know what you're talking about. That's something else. This is the original bust. What color skin is Tutankhamun's skin? Look at Meritaten's hairstyle. Look at Amos's hairstyle.
Beautiful.
This is the great 18th dynasty. This is the dynasty that restored order to Kemet. And I'm emphasizing this to you all. If you've read The Destruction of Black Civilization, you kind of know what I'm getting at. Every time the original Black people of Kemet ascended to power, there was stability. They had returned Kemet to its original vibe. Construction began, the economy stabilized, culture took center stage, and there was peace. It was during these intermediate periods, and then ultimately the late periods and the Greco-Roman periods where you had the Ptolemaic pharaohs, that we see the complete atrophy of what used to be Kemetic culture. All right, so if you can't see the screen, I'm just going to read it out to you all real quickly. From 1150 to 1069 BC, Kemet fell into decline from wave after wave of non-Black invasions. The survivors of these invasions were pushed south into present-day Sudan, where they preserved their culture and began to reorganize. The campaign to retake their lands to the north was finally successful under Pianki in 715 BC. However, this would only last for about 100 years, because after so many centuries of invasions, and it's miraculous that Kemet even stood for that 5,500 years. The invaders had so completely corrupted the administration, so completely corrupted the culture, that the last dynasty, the 25th dynasty, the last Black dynasty, and parts of the 26th dynasty, they weren't able to rebuild what was torn down. So those are the three most important dynasties in Kemetic history. Actually, the first through the 8th dynasty, the 18th dynasty, and then the 25th dynasty. Those are the three most important periods in Kemetic history. That first period was so important because, first of all, it lasted 1,000 years. And during that period, you had a lot of the great construction that we're known for. You had a lot of the great thinkers that we were known for. Imhotep, you had the Rand Papyrus, or the development of high mathematics. You had the development of advanced surgeries, heart surgery, brain surgery. You had mummification. You had high spiritual culture. All these things, and that happened at Abydos. All these things happened in the first 1,000 years of Kemetic history. All right, and that happened after Menes unified us into one people. And ever since then, we've been getting pushed further and further south. So we held the line at the first division between the northern lands and the southern lands. We were pushed further south into Sudan. We held the line there. Fast forward to today, and in 2015, South Sudan and the Nilotes there are continuing to hold the line despite being pushed even further south by the Arabs that now occupy northern Sudan. This is a 5,000-year-long war that we found ourselves engaged in. So with that being said, family, hey, I love you all. Thank you all for spending some time with me this Saturday. Next week is probably going to be the most powerful, the most climactic of this series. It's going to be an important week, so make sure y'all are here, all right? I love y'all. Bibi Fahodie.
All right.
Why, Harry?